Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a big approach.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review episode for July 2nd, 2024. I am Brendan Cassidy, and I am without my usual partner in crime, JD Duran, right now, who, as many of you may know, is still battling a bit of a bad cough and couldn't make it to the theater for this review. And, you know, for a film with a title like A Quiet Place, Day One, a loud cough is certainly a valid reason for skipping out on this one, so I commend him for that one. It also makes for a really great opportunity for me to talk to one of my favorite guests that we've had on this show before, our very own Shadan Larki. Shadan, welcome back to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Can I say I had the same thing where I was like in the theater and I needed to sneeze and I was nervous to sneeze and then I was like, wait, you're allowed to sneeze. They're not in the room with you.
I know. Yeah. There are certain movies where I think the etiquette almost becomes part of the film in a way, like it's almost like a hidden character of sorts. And the Quiet Place films, those are movies you really have to abide by theater etiquette. Otherwise, you might really ruin the experience. And we'll certainly talk about that here as well.
Mm-hmm.
Last time you and I spoke in podcast form, I think was for our review of Civil War, the Alex Garland film.
Yep. Which is why I mentioned that I'm happy to be here for a movie that I actually enjoy.
Oh, getting right to it. I love that.
Yep.
It was surprising. That conversation we had on that film, despite the divisiveness of it, I felt like that conversation we had was surprisingly more civil than maybe it should have been. I think that'll make it for a really interesting trajectory in how we feel about A Quiet Place. I wonder if we'll repeat that same civility for this conversation here. I didn't know where you sat on this film until you just said so right there, that you actually enjoyed this one. So I'm really looking forward to getting your thoughts on A Quiet Place Day One. But I did want to open up the floor by talking about the franchise in general up front. So I want to toss it over to you first. With regard to this being the third installment in this sci-fi horror franchise, what are your overall thoughts on its two predecessors, the two films that were helmed by John Krasinski, A Quiet Place Parts 1 and 2?
So it's so interesting because when they announced A Quiet Place Part 2 that it was going to be a sequel, I was really disappointed because I was like, when I saw the first one, I was like, I want to know how this all started. I want a prequel. And I was like, so hoping that the second, and my favorite aspect of the second one was like the opening, whatever, 5-10 minutes that does act like a little bit of a prequel. So I would say that I really like the first one. I've seen it multiple times. And I mean, it's a flawed film, but it's kind of I can forgive its flaws and I can give myself over to it. And I really enjoy it. The second one, other than that 5-10 minutes of the beginning, I think was like very forgettable, and I wouldn't be able to tell you many plot points about it beyond that. And I will go ahead and take a big swing and say that Day One is my favorite of the three.
Wow.
I liked it that much. Yeah.
So interesting. I'm so glad you're on this conversation. I'll just simply say that. Before I get to my thoughts on Day One, I'll say with regard to the first two, I do like them as well. I like their sense of containment, but I also like how they're almost like this weird, there's a weird meta quality to them as well, especially that first one. When you consider John Krasinski and Emily Blunt as a real life married couple, it's almost like they're using that first film as a way to channel their own authentic fears of becoming a family. And I don't know if that was in their actual DNA, if that was their intent, but it is something that does come off in that first film, which is why there is a great drama underneath that. I think that first A Quiet Place is a better drama than it is a horror film for me. And then part two, I think, is a better horror film than it is a drama. It's like they kind of scratch each other's itches in different ways. I like the filmmaking of part two a little bit better, which is why I think my favorite might actually be part two of the three. I'll just say that right now. So that's where this is going to get really interesting. I think John Krasinski really came into his own a little bit more with part two, but he is not directing A Quiet Place Day One. In fact, what's interesting here is, wasn't Jeff Nichols supposed to be directing Day One at first, and then he actually went off to make The Bike Riders instead? I remember hearing that he was once tied to this film, and I'm kind of glad he made the bike riders instead. I like that one quite a bit. But with day one here, as we get into this film, I know you already laid your cards that this is your favorite one in the franchise. Let's talk about why. This one was co-written and directed by Michael Sarnoski, whose previous film Pig, starring Nicolas Cage, was one of my favorite films of 2021. I assume you enjoyed that one as well, Shadan. I was honestly a little worried seeing him, take on a rather high-profile franchise this early, but we'll talk about maybe why there were some good things here and why that was maybe a wise call, what that could lead to him in the future. This film, A Quiet Place Day One, stars Lupita Nyong'o, Joseph Quinn, as well as two cats named Schnitzel and Nico, both playing the adorable Frodo. We also get Alex Wolff here in a small role. We get Jaimin Hunsu reprising his role from A Quiet Place Part 2, adding some continuity to the franchise, I guess. And this film here, Day One, it's about what you'd expect. It's day one of this event. We follow a woman named Sam who finds herself trapped in New York City this time around during the early stages of an invasion by the alien creatures with ultra sensitive hearing. There's a lot more to it than just that, but in a way, the simplicity of that plot synopsis, I think, is kind of emblematic of the film as a whole. I think we should also note that while we won't get into spoilers, at least I don't think we should get into specific spoilers. I want people to experience the film's climax with fresh eyes. We may need to talk about some specific aspects of the plot, maybe some things regarding certain characters and how they're introduced. And these are things that the marketing has been deliberately hiding from us, which is a really interesting thing for them to do. You don't often see that with most marketing these days. So I'm curious about how we feel about that. So I just wanted to lay the groundwork there that we may get into some specific things. Although for those of you listening, given the box office numbers of the film, you may have already seen the film already. So I think we'll be in okay hands. So with all of that said, Shadan, you already said this is your favorite film in the franchise. Why don't you tell us why?
Well, I have to be honest in that going in, I did not have high expectations at all. I saw this film primarily for two reasons. One is
Okay.
Lupita, and two
Yeah.
is to be on this podcast. Like whenever JD was like, "Oh, do you like? Oh, are you available?"
We gave
to do
you
this? I was like,
homework here.
right. Well, I was like, I wasn't sure if I was gonna go see it, and then this opportunity came up, and I was like, I like Lupita. Like, I'll go see it. And I'm so happy that I did see it in a theater. I don't think I would have enjoyed it as much seeing it at home. I think you're absolutely right that like the crowd and sort of that like nervousness, like you could hear people trying to be as quiet as possible, like munching on their popcorn, like all of that really adds to the atmosphere.
Sure.
Yeah, I think, and I should say Us is one of my favorite movies of the past 5-10 years. Whenever it came out, I love that movie. Lupita's performance in that is
how did she not get an Oscar nomination?
Exactly. And I think that is one of the strongest aspects of this film is her performance and her ability to say so much while she has to be completely silent. I mean, her eyes are so emotive. And I think if you had somebody else in this lead role, I probably would not feel as strongly about this film, but I just think she completely blew me away. And I was thinking while I was watching it, I mean, she has an Oscar, but I still feel like she's one of our most underrated actresses. Like she is so capable and has so much natural charisma, and you want to follow her. And so she's just phenomenal. I think this movie is so, and all of the movies in the franchise, but this one in particular is so good at making you care about these characters pretty quickly. I thought, and Joseph Quinn is also an actor that I am not familiar with. I think the first time I heard his name was in relation to the Fantastic Four.
Yeah,
casting.
I think most people might agree with that. I know he was in Stranger Things for a bit as well, and he's got other few television roles that he's been tied to.
Which I have not seen, and I was completely impressed with what he did. I mean, even Alex Wolff, which he doesn't have a very big role, but I feel like he was so effective in the scenes that he was in.
Yeah.
I'll keep going, but I'll turn it over to you.
I am so glad you really like this movie, and I do like it as well. Let me just get that out of the way. I did enjoy myself for maybe reasons that even surprised me. It is probably my least favorite of the three, and I think primarily maybe it was my headspace going into it, but this film somehow goes from being one of what I think was one of the cheapest and most insincere blockbusters of the year to one of the sweetest and most tender. And I think a lot of it really comes down to how a movie can just simply stick the landing and forgive everything that comes before it for me. We'll talk maybe a little bit more about why I think the final act here is really the best thing about it, because we are introduced to a particular character here under very particular circumstances. The character Sam, played by Lupita Nyong'o, and again, we may lay some groundwork here that the marketing isn't giving us, but Sam is someone on hospice. She has, I don't think they establish what type of cancer it is, but it is something, it is definitely a sickness that is absolutely terminal. And on top of that, she has a support cat named Frodo. So first off, Frodo, Sam, how clever is that you've got those two Lord of the Rings names there already, and you've got a cute animal. It's adorable. You're always going to latch on to those innocent eyes, whether it be a dog or a cat or whatever it is. And you're also setting this in New York City, so you're going to have instant comparisons to something like 9/11. So with that checklist there, I felt like this movie was kind of using it for simply cheap and gimmicky purposes to try and almost like to trick us into thinking, oh, you're supposed to care about these people. Here are the usual tropes why. But much of these so-called tricks do come to fruition in that final act, and it almost justifies their inclusion. I do want to talk more about that. I don't want to jump right to it yet, but it's just so interesting that it concludes in such a way where I found myself thinking, even if this is my least favorite film of the three, it might have my favorite scene of the entire franchise, being that final act, specifically the scene in the jazz club, I'll simply say. And it's corny as heck. It shouldn't really work, but it starts to justify everything that this franchise has always been about for me, and that's the human drama underneath the apocalyptic. And I think it does that really well. So there's more to talk about for sure, but I'm glad we both at least like it. Just sounds like you like it a little bit more than I do.
Yeah, I think if you are going into this film kind of for the monster elements and that aspect, maybe you would end up being disappointed. For me, what I always liked, I agree with you, was the characters and the relationships, and I think it does such a good job of setting up like the Lupita and Joseph Quinn like relationship. I was so invested in that, and even like the relationship Alex Wolff plays her nurse, and so like immediately I felt like that bond between them. And so yeah, I think if you are looking for like maybe the jump scares or what was traditionally in the first and second one, you may find this one to be a little bit lacking. It just happens that for me, those were the aspects of the film that I cared, those other films that I cared about the least. And in fact, in this one, like there were certain sequences where I was like, okay, can we get back to the people now? Like I've seen, you know, being quiet for the monsters. Like I've seen this in 2 other films, and I found myself sort of less invested in that aspect of it.
Yeah. I'm with you in that regard. I think of the 3, this is, and maybe this is why it is my least favorite. It's not because I go into these movies looking for the monster elements. That's not what I latch onto. But I think we get a lot of it here to try to fill in the space for a 90-minute movie. And I do think the monster elements in this one aren't as effective as they are in the first 2 films. I think John Krasinski just had a better handle on the horror and the thriller side of this franchise. That opening day 1 sequence in their hometown in part 2, I think is stellar. I think the direction there, it's almost Spielbergian in a way. And I feel like he's handling that in a better way with a bit more grace and a bit more fluidity than Michael Sarnoski is. Because if you compare his filmmaking here to something like, say, Pig, which was his debut film, there's a calmness to that movie, Pig specifically. He's very good at the no pun intended, the quieter character moments. And we do get a lot of those here, which does ultimately save the movie. It's really just those moments in between where I feel like, okay, these are the gears turning. The jump scares here feel a little bit more like studio notes adding these in because they're required to be here for this type of genre film. And I'm not sure if he has the best handle on those. So the alien invasion stuff this time around is probably the lesser that the franchise has been at this point. But again, I might have to jump to that final act for just a moment here. And I'll say this briefly, and I'll let you chime in with anything you have to say. The thing I love about that final act is that it bravely ignores that this is a post-apocalyptic thriller. It deliberately pushes that all aside as if to say none of that even mattered at all. This has always been about something else entirely. And if anything, the sense of place, the setting, the post-apocalyptic backdrop was more there for kind of a symbolic purpose in many ways. And I do like how the film kind of reverse engineers that in a way. In fact, the final act is eerily similar to Pig in ways that I did not expect. And it's here, this is why I could tell Michael Sarnoski was brought on board. I genuinely think that final act is really incredible, and it really saved the movie for me.
Yeah, I completely agree with it. I mean, so when they introduced that, Lupita's character Sam has cancer, I kind of had the same thoughts as you initially. I was like, why is this a choice? It felt like a lot of times in the movie it wasn't relevant to anything that was happening to her. So I was like, why is this?
I was
But
thinking
it
the same
does,
thing. I was thinking, like, can you
yeah.
just make her a tortured artist or something like that, and maybe get rid of the whole sickness element? Is that just added here for sympathy points? But
Mhm.
no, there's a purpose to it.
Yeah, there's major payoff to that. And I mean, I think it's just it's so beautiful. It's like once you see the ending, you sort of realize it's never been about her survival. Like from the beginning, we know what's going to happen to her. So it's about how does she navigate these few days? How does she navigate these new people that come into her life? And she's able to show so many people so much compassion, even though she really doesn't have to. I mean, she has nothing to
Yeah.
lose here. And so it's, as you were saying, the point is not the post-apocalyptic of it all. It's almost like how does she learn to live again? How does she learn to survive in these circumstances? And I just found so much beauty in that. And I found there's so many, first of all, shots in the movie that I really loved, sort of shots of her that are isolated among all of the craziness that I thought were just so beautifully put together. And I mean, there's this really subtle moment where she is just like smelling these old books with so much joy, and
Yeah. The
or even
simplicities.
like
Yeah.
the simplicity, or the taste of a slice of pizza that she's been wanting, and all of that, the beauty and sort of finding these moments of simplicity and joy among all this crazy stuff, and the fact that she is
Yeah.
able to build this like genuine connection with somebody who she just met and extend them so much kindness and compassion. I don't know. I'm sappy. I'm an emotional person.
I am too. I wear it on my sleeve very much.
Yeah, I do too. I cried a lot, which is not what I was expecting. I thought that this
I
was gonna
teared
be
up.
just,
I did. I got a little misty
yeah.
at the end. I really did. And if a movie does that to you, that's probably, I mean, sometimes there could be trickery there that you're willing to admit later on. But I think in some ways it's sort of earned trickery in this regard, because the problems I had with the movie leading up to that final act, they did seem like they were deliberate choices to pull the rug from under your feet to suggest, yeah, the post-apocalyptic stuff doesn't really matter here. This really is a journey of a woman who, and this is at least how I read it, a woman who has kind of accepted her fate in many ways, but she wants to be able to die on her terms. She wants to be able to retain that autonomy. And this is really a movie about an overarching scenario that's robbing that of her, and she doesn't want to lose that. I heard a lot of people joke that this is basically a movie about, like the troubles of trying to get a slice of pizza in New York City. That's kind of what the movie is about. That actually is, in many ways, the plot synopsis. There is more to the why she wants that slice of pizza. Maybe we don't have to get too much into that, because I think that maybe veers a bit more heavily into spoiler territory. But the why makes sense, and it makes sense as to why she was battling this sickness for so long. It actually justifies the need for it to be in this movie, because it is ultimately about a woman trying to die on her own terms. It's her choice, it's her autonomy. She doesn't want to lose sight of that. And in the process, she's able to influence someone else to their own survival, someone that she didn't even really get to know. The Joseph Quinn character here of Eric, I believe his name is, if I'm not mistaken. Very much an underwritten character in many ways. Like, some might be able to argue that, I wish we got more of him. I wish we knew more about him. But I'm glad we don't, because it's not his story. We know just as much about him as Sam knows about him. This whole movie is through her lens. It's her perspective. So if we know more about him, that kind of muffles that perspective a little bit, and I think makes it too movie-like, if that makes sense. So I like that this is very limited in that regard, and it's really the fact that she chose to pay attention to someone more or less that she didn't even really know. So why should we know more about him? But I think that's well handled, especially when we get to that final act.
And I think that is realistic. Sometimes people come into your life and they have an impact, and you don't necessarily know every detail about them. And I found the idea of the character of Eric is like, well, he's in law school and that's obviously gone. His family is in England. And so it's like he also in many ways doesn't necessarily have a reason to survive. I mean, what is he fighting for? That's kind of what he's struggling with when we meet him. And so this idea that he through her is also able to find, as you were saying, sort of this fight for survival that he didn't have before.
Yeah.
Again, I found it really affecting. And I think, there are obviously flaws in this film and we'll talk about it. I just think for me, I'm just able to overlook those things because it made me feel in a way that was so profound and so much more than what I was expecting. So I think that's why.
The emotional payoff, that's what matters. And sometimes you can forget those things. Before we get into some of those flaws that you may also have about the film, should we talk about Frodo? Should we talk about the cat?
Listen, okay, actually the cat might be one of my, if I want to nitpick here, because adorable cat, the fact that his name was Frodo, I mean, come on. It doesn't get, and I have to admit here that I had not seen The Lord of the Rings for the first 29 years of my life until a month ago when they did the cinematic re-release and I went and saw all three. So I am fresh into my Lord of the Rings fandom. I had my nerd out moment about all that.
That's great.
But like there were so many moments where that cat should not have survived. Okay. if we want to talk about something that takes you out of the realistic aspects of the movie, like that cat would have been long gone, bless his heart.
That, cats are very resourceful, I'll simply say. I grew up actually in a cat household as opposed to a dog household, and I can't tell you how many times we've had cats leave our house in the middle of the winter to come back 3 months later as if nothing has ever happened. So I know they're resourceful, but of course, I didn't grow up in a post-apocalyptic world. So there are other circumstances happening in this movie that could certainly add some validity to your criticisms there. I think if anything, I'm kind of torn on Frodo as a figure in this movie. On one hand, yes, it's an adorable cat. You're going to latch onto those innocent eyes. Sympathy points is going to be it's going to be the name of the game in many ways. I do wonder if there was more of a missed opportunity here in making Frodo even more of a character, because I sometimes wonder if there was really just the intent on turning Frodo into sympathy points. I'm not sure if it really went much beyond that, which is why I can both defend but also criticize the inclusion of Frodo. You're absolutely right, though. There are many moments where I thought, wow, how did Frodo get from there to there in like 3 minutes? I mean, New York City's big. It's not that small. But I get that this is a movie. You sometimes have to take some liberties and make some literal physical cuts in where you can actually get to places in a certain amount of time. But yeah, you're not wrong. There are times that Frodo should not have made it, but I think it's hilarious when you look at it that way.
I mean, it was very clever to make it a cat because cats are generally quiet animals. And
True.
I mean, I think it's like she needed something that was like, she needed a connection to something. So I get why it was.
That's right.
I was not. Yeah, I wasn't as like, I guess, emotionally attached to the cat. I can appreciate. It would have been take it or leave it for me. Sorry, no offense to cat people out there, but.
Well, yeah, and that's where I'm battling with it, because I understand the purpose for Sam as a character and that connection that she has to something else, the support system that cat brings her. But I think by not fleshing out the cat a little bit more, I feel like it's maybe an over exploitation of the Bambi effect in some ways. And I'm not sure if it really fully justified its inclusion, especially when Sam's not even on screen. There are times when Eric and Frodo are intermingling. The cat gives a great performance, or I should say 2 great performances. Nico and Schnitzel, as their names are. We have 2 cats that look identical that are playing the role of Frodo, and it's a very good and committed performance. I'm not 100% sold on the inclusion just yet. I think it works in places, but then it doesn't work in other places, if that makes sense.
That's fair. I'll write a Chasing the Gold column about Frodo the cat. Best supporting actor. So far, Austin Butler, who? This is
Austin Butler, who? No, it's Schnitzel and Nico. That's who we're talking
Yeah.
about here.
Yeah.
So what were some of those other, I guess, quibbles that you may have had with the film if you didn't get a chance to talk about those yet?
This is probably my biggest one, which is Jaimin Hansu, an actor again that every time he came on screen, I just thought we have done this man so dirty. He is one of the finest actors I think we have, and he is constantly relegated to these supporting roles. And I do remember that one of my least favorite aspects of part 2 was the fact that his character, I don't even think has a name. I think it's like man, according
He's
to IMDb.
nameless. Yeah, he's nameless.
Yeah, it's like man on the island. And so I thought, what a good opportunity to have him pop up here and flesh it out. And we did not get that at all. I mean,
we got something, but I don't know if it's enough to justify him as a reoccurring character just yet. I mean, maybe the intent is that if we get, I don't know, 7 or 8 films in this franchise, he's the constant that pops up that adds more layers to maybe his arc. He has a moment in this movie, day 1 specifically, that I did find really interesting, to the point that I would actually like to see a separate movie on just that moment and the ramifications it has on his family, where they encounter someone early on that is about to have a panic attack, essentially, which is going to lead to, a scream and noise. That's a very dangerous thing for this world. So he reacts in a way to protect not just the people around him, but most importantly, his son, who's looking at what's happening over in the stairwell just right around the corner. And Jaimin Hansu's reaction is so forceful, he accidentally kills this man. I think that's a really interesting thing. Movie doesn't really do anything with that, though. And I'm kind of torn on, does it need to be here? I like that it's here. It's a neat layer. Does it correlate to his inclusion in part 2? No, it simply raises more questions. Will we get more answers to that maybe in a future film or films down the line? So I feel like my thoughts on Jaimin Hansu, I'm sort of in the same camp as you are, Shadan, but they're also kind of incomplete at this point, because I'm not sure if they're going to do anything more with that character based on what we've seen from him. It's hard to tell if he's really just here as the connective tissue to say, hey, this is still in the same world in case you forgot. And I'm not sure if it goes much further than that at this point yet.
But the problem is that his character was so paper thin in the second. Like, I forgot that he was even in the second one until I went on IMDb. So I think if you are using it as connective tissue, I don't think it works. And I think that moment could have been...
He might as well be a different character anyway.
Right, exactly. That could have been anyone. And so I just think that it's a big wasted opportunity. Like, if you were going to have connective tissue, it should have been something stronger. And I just think for somebody of that caliber, I just don't, that really didn't work for me. Now I do think he made the most of that moment. And especially you were saying, like, the sort of instant regret that he has after he's forced to do that. And
good in a vacuum.
Right. And I think that's such an interesting juxtaposition of all sort of post-apocalyptic movies, of like the moments in where we do find our humanity and the moments where our humanity is like stripped from us and we're forced to make these choices. That's probably something that could have been wrestled with more in this film if we wanted to again nitpick it. But I just his inclusion really didn't work for me. And I don't know if setting things up for future films, like, this isn't an Avengers franchise. Like, I don't need you to...
You're right. Yeah. And sorry to cut you off. I was just going to say, I think my biggest problem there, and you're really hitting the nail on the head, is this a franchise that even needs any established continuity? I don't think you need it. So if you're going to have him here, he has a great moment. There's a lot of layers to just that moment, and he sells the moment, Jaimin Hansu specifically. But is there a need to have that type of continuity between day one and what is it, day 472 or something like that,
Mhm.
in the John Krasinski verse of these stories. I don't know if that's really all that necessary. I think the thing that works best for this franchise is that you seem to have this one sliver. You have parts one and part two that are basically operating in their own, not timeline, but their own story arc, right? They're connected to a specific family. This one's connected to a new, not family, but a new set of individuals. Like the sense of containment that all of these different stories have, I think, is part of the charm. So to have Jaimin Hunsu come back in that way, it kind of feels like a studio note in some ways. It's like, no, we need some continuity here. We need people to remember that this is a Quiet Place film because they're not going to remember that's in the freaking title, right? So yeah, that might be part of it as well.
Do you know if are they doing a part 3?
I think they are. I just don't know the specifics around it yet. I don't know the like the intent on who they're following as far as which characters they're following, or if it's going to be a completely new uh uh uh, I guess like set of characters in its
Right.
own world or something. Which I think we still need to continue. What parts one and parts two left off because they both end on deliberate cliffhangers. They almost work like these individual sequences that are all building to something bigger. So it's almost like, not to make a Star Wars comparison, but I'm going to. I mean, that is that I feel like anytime you mention Star Wars, you're about to get hate mail somewhere. But within Star Wars, for a while, you had the episodic films, you had the Skywalker saga, but then you also had individual components like Rogue One or the other television shows. I feel like in some ways, A Quiet Place Part One and then Part Two, that's kind of like this world's quote unquote episodic stories, like their Skywalker saga, and then we have these other subset stories that have their own individualized intents. And I like that this one has that, which is why maybe having Jaimin Hunsu here in the first place, I'm not sure what the intent is. Like the more I talk about it, the more I'm now criticizing it. I wasn't really on
Yeah.
that point, but I'm glad you brought that up. I'm like I'm finding new things to maybe feel a little frustrated about his conclusion here.
Yeah, I left this movie thinking that I would be completely happy if we left the sort of John Krasinski universe behind and if we had almost like an anthology, just different characters that we
Yeah.
followed within this world. I think that that's such an interesting way to continue it. As far as I'm concerned, I mean I think Emily Blunt is phenomenal. She's probably the best part of those first two films for me, but I
Sure.
don't necessarily need to revisit that.
Yeah, the only reason why I say I might think I need to is that part two does end on a bit of a cliffhanger as well. Not really a cliffhanger. There's still a little bit that could be explored there, but the anthology-like approach I think is an interesting one. I don't think we don't see many franchises do that, and given the success of this movie, it seems as though people are really latching on to the fact that they like this world. It doesn't really matter about the characters. As long as the story is still there, the situation is still there. Hey, maybe we'll get one from the alien perspective one day. What are their motivations? Like, what are they here for? Why did they come to Earth? And I like those questions too.
Let's talk about that for a second. Was that something that you went in thinking was going to be more explored here? Because that's when I heard they were doing a prequel, that's what I thought we were getting. And I'm happy to not get that. I don't know if I necessarily need that, but is that something that you were expecting or
I didn't really know what I was expecting. I went into this movie rather blind, aside from just some of the small trailers that we got leading up to it. But I'm glad we don't get much more into it. I like that we still have that mystery. If I had to have made a guess, I would have expected the movie to handle it like it does. That we would not get that kind of backstory, primarily because I feel like the overall ethos and how these movies are structured is that they all take place within a very short amount of time. So given that, it's hard to really, I guess, find what those motivations are or what those rules are. You're always going to have very limited knowledge, which allows for a lot of great dramatic irony. It puts us as an audience steps ahead of the characters, which adds to the thrill in some ways. So I kind of expected in a weird way that we were not going to get the alien backstory here. And I don't know if we'll ever get that. I'm not really clamoring for that. But I'm not surprised that we didn't get that here, because it really does only take place over a span of what, maybe 2 days, 3 days, something like that. So it's really hard to
Yeah.
establish any type of knowledge in that short amount of time.
It's interesting you mentioned that though, because one of the questions that I had when I was watching, and I don't know if this is the criticism, maybe it is, but it seemed like I thought maybe they were going to struggle more with what are the rules of this. Like it seems like they figure out pretty quickly that we need to be quiet. If we go towards water, it gives us more of an opportunity. Like I don't know, I was expecting more of a struggle of like how are we supposed to deal with these creatures
We
than what
learn
we
about
got.
we learn about how to survive very quickly. The military basically announces right away how you're supposed to survive, which, like, I've seen some tweets on Twitter over the past few days, a few critics at different publications, calling attention to how, what is it? I think the New York Post writing articles about how you're supposed to keep quiet, and how those articles are posted in that first movie. And yet, wait a minute, don't those printing presses make a lot of noise? Like, so like it does lead to some plot holes if you really want to go
Yeah.
that deep into it. I'm not as interested in those plot holes, but at the same time, yeah, the early establishment of how to try to survive this game in this movie, it's an interesting choice to do that. I don't necessarily dislike that. But I do think this one, day one specifically, does get rather clever with how it, I guess, utilizes the tropes in ways to stay quiet in this world. The use of water comes back once again, I think, in a very clever way. The way that thunderstorms are utilized here, I think, are very clever. That's actually another one of the best scenes in the movie. There's a real moment of catharsis happening there, a literal scream of sorts alongside a thunderstorm that I did find pretty moving, if I'm being perfectly honest. And even the way when many people are simply walking along the street together, that creates this like constant hum, just how all their footprints sort of reverberate off each other, maybe adds this potential level of safety. I think this movie does get a little clever in some of the some of the some of what it's doing sonically, if that makes sense. I did like some of that.
Yeah, the thunder moment that you're mentioning, that was the moment that I went from, okay, I'm going along with what's happening, to I really love this. Like that was just completely sold me. One of my favorite scenes I've seen this year. Like I feel like when I'm making a list, spoiler alert, I'm making a list of my favorite movies for an article of the year thus far. And I feel like
Okay.
at the end of the year, when I look back on the films of 2024, like that is going to be the moment from A Quiet Place day one that I'm going to remember.
Okay.
And to your earlier point, I mean, I do think that having it set in New York City really works here, just because it is the
Okay.
loudest city in the world. So if you're thinking
Yeah.
of like, now all of a sudden you have to be quiet, how does that work in a city like New York? Like, if it's set in like Houston, okay, but you have to set it in a city that's just so I think New York works, and I think because New York is such a hodgepodge of people, it works in this. There's several moments in the film where Lupita's character is sort of thrown together with somebody else, and I think that is New York City now without the alien invasion. So I think it works.
Yeah. Did you think at all about, let's say, something like 9/11 while watching this, though, given the circumstances? There's even a very deliberate look at an I Heart New York bag, as if to see it as like a love letter to
Mhm.
New York. And I see your point. That's why I agree that setting it in any other city may take away from the what it's meant to do sonically. The fact that this is a very loud city. At the same time, I do wonder, is it distasteful in a way, the way that maybe it might over exploit the 9/11 isms inadvertently? Like, and I don't say that as really a criticism. I say that as a genuine question. I kind of wonder if it's over exploiting that for its own, I guess, thrilling game. And I do wonder, is there a possibility that this could have been set in, let's say, Chicago or something like that? I'm not really sure. It's something I was wrestling with, but I did think about if New York City was genuinely the right place for it.
I took the I love New York moment. I took that to be more of her relationship to the city, because we learn
Okay,
that because she's in hospice, she sort of has to leave the city, right? So
sure,
like New York not only represents the
it's a good
city of
point.
New York, but it represents what she had before when she was healthy and youthful. And
Hmm.
so she's sort of mourning like the literal destruction of New York City, but also the destruction of what New York represented to her.
That's a good point. That's actually a really good point. Okay, so I'm coming around in a little bit more. Um, yeah, so a couple of the things I did want to talk about too before we get to our final thoughts on this one. I have to give Michael Sarnoski a lot of credit for reteaming with a lot of his same individuals he worked with on Pig. Have you seen Pig?
I haven't, and now that throughout this conversation, I'm filled with regret because I probably should have watched it, and I will
Yeah,
after this. But
it's quite great. I think it's available on Hulu. So if you have a Hulu subscription, it's available there. Yeah, even my parents love that movie. I don't know of anyone that disliked Pig, but he is reteaming with a lot of his same people behind the camera, such as Alexis Grapsis, I believe the individual's name is, who does the music here and also did the music for Pig, and then Pat Scola, the cinematographer for both of these films. And I like when filmmakers, even when they're making that transition into something bigger, something more high profile like this is, especially when compared to something like Pig, they still keep their same players with them as if they're still giving them that same chance. And despite this being a rather big movie, it's also not really a big movie. It is treated with a bit of an independent spirit, which I did appreciate. The movie was reportedly made with a budget of somewhere between 60 and 70 million. So it was budgeted smartly. And worldwide, it already hit, I think, 100 million as we're recording this. So it's already surpassed its budget. Maybe not enough to say it's broken even at this point yet, rather. But that early on, I think it maybe has the right legs to do something good if the early digital release doesn't hurt it. So I just wanted to say I appreciate when a filmmaker does bring their old players with them. And I do see enough consistency here between Pig and this movie to say, okay, it doesn't fully feel like a director for hire job. At times it kind of does, but the quieter moments between characters here, that was all in the DNA of the movie Pig. And I'm glad that that's retained here. So that's really exciting to see.
yeah, I really like that this, again, movie sort of takes the post-apocalyptic alien invasion, but is still on a smaller scale. In fact, I was worried. I was like, oh, maybe the studio gave them more money now and they're going to add in things that feel extra. And to me, that wasn't really the case. Like, it still very much kept the spirit of the first two.
Sure.
And so I wish more films would do this. I wish more films would take the crazy outlandish thing and sort of strip it down. And I think the cinematography and the score in particular were probably the two strongest sort of craft elements of the film for me. There were just so many shots that I thought were really stunning and clever, and I did like the score quite a bit.
Yeah, I did too. Do you have any final thoughts on A Quiet Place Day One as we round out this conversation?
Well, I did want to ask you, what did you think of the creature design for this one?
I thought it was fine. I feel like it's still pretty consistent with what we've seen thus far, but I still feel like we're getting enough of it in the shadows that I feel like I still don't fully know what this thing looks like in totality. And I like that. I like that each movie almost gives us a brief new glimpse at them and some new element to them that we haven't seen yet. So I thought they looked pretty clever. I thought they were pretty thrilling.
Yeah, there was a, like, I don't even know if you want to call it like an egg hatch scene, but we got to see like
that was interesting.
That was interesting, like baby creatures. That was an interesting addition that I wasn't expecting. But
almost like we're gonna get like velociraptor babies haunting the city or something like that. All of a sudden, this turns into Jurassic Park. The one final thought I do have before we round out this conversation. I'm not going to give this away because I won't dare spoil the final shot of this movie. I think the final shot is incredible. I don't love the needle drop, I'll simply say. There's a particular song that plays at the end over those end credits that admittedly I found kind of eye-rolly, if I'm being honest. I'm not sure if you felt the same way on that.
I maybe not as strongly as you did, but I was like, okay. I will say there is something about the ending, a sort of voiceover moment that I could have done without, because I felt like it accomplished all those things that did, and it was sort of like beating it over the head with a hammer, and it was a little bit heavy-handed, and I was like, you already did that. You don't need. It's kind of the show don't tell thing, right?
That's fair. That's very fair.
Yeah.
It does maybe, I guess, literalize things a little bit
Right.
too much by that point.
Yeah.
And with regard to that final song choice, I think maybe that's why I had some issues with it, because I think it does some similar things that voiceover is also doing. It's, making it seem a little bit too easy and a little bit too on the nose. And on top of that, I can't. Every time I hear that song now in a movie, I'm going to think of my favorite movie from last year, which was Wim Wenders' Perfect Days, which I'm not sure if you had a chance to see.
I love that movie. Also one of my favorites of last year, yeah.
Oh gosh, that's one of my favorites of the decade, if I'm being honest. But if you've seen that movie and you haven't seen A Quiet Place Day One, then I may have already spoiled what that song choice is. But Perfect Days concludes with that song. And every time I hear it now, I'm going to think of that movie. So sadly, hearing it here once again completely took me out of the moment. And I will admit that's a me problem. That is not a criticism of the movie. That is me really projecting my own things onto it, which is not fair to a Quiet Place Day One. But needless to say, it is something that sadly did make me roll my eyes a little bit, because I love the ending. I think the ending here, the whole final act especially, really serves as like a deconstruction of what post-apocalyptic thrillers are ultimately all about. I love the way it treats it in a very almost symbolic way, an almost metaphorical way, and suggests that none of this really mattered. This was about something else, and really this is just about a personal journey, and the post-apocalyptic backdrop is just getting in the way. That's all this really is. I found that really fascinating. Any other final thoughts you have on this one, Shadan, before we round this out?
That's exactly what makes this film so special to me. Is, again, I'm going to take every trope you've seen before, but I'm going to do something else with it. And I'm going to introduce characters that you have no right to care about, but I'm going to make you care about them.
Yeah.
And I wish more movies would do this. I went into this movie thinking I don't need this movie to exist, and now I'm thinking I'm so glad that this movie exists.
Yeah.
And it is a movie that I'm gonna revisit. I think if you, like me, have been touched by sort of these illnesses and stuff, there's so much that you will recognize in sort of, again, the beauty of life. And I know that sounds sappy and cliche, but that's what I left thinking about, is like,
beauty in the mundane. We talk about that with so many movies, and this movie is weirdly about that as well.
That is what it's about, and I think that is so beautiful. And I said it up top, but I just think what Lupita does here is astounding. She did not have to give as much. I mean, she could have phoned it in and been completely fine, I gotta be honest with you, but she just does something so remarkable. And again, her eyes, there's so many moments that I'm haunted by, of like just the pain and the loss and the, like, I don't know, again, acceptance, like you were saying. She kind of comes to accept her position in life, and I just found it to be really beautiful. And if they wanted to do 10 other movies following, other people, and I think one thing that I was thinking about watching it is, like, a lot of times when we do see these post-apocalyptic movies, there's a certain kind of character that we see. It's like kind of the John Krasinski, like, strong, strapping guy. But like, there are people in the world who are struggling with other stuff when the world ends. And so like, it's kind of cool that we get to see what that's like, of like, well, yeah, the world is ending, but your life was kind of sucky before, and what do you do with that? I just thought that was so fascinating. And I mean, yes, it's not a perfect movie. Like, I know that I've seen the arguments. I know that there are flaws. There were moments in the film that I maybe was taken out of it or lost my concentration, but I think the moments that really hit, and there are some scenes and sequences that are just so strong. And I'm excited to see what Joseph Quinn does with Fantastic Four. And I want Lupita, maybe she'll be the new horror scream queen. I would be completely fine with that.
Why she hasn't become a bigger star at this point is beyond me. I mean, a lot of us were predicting that after we saw 12 Years a Slave, and when she won the Oscar for 12 Years a Slave. I think it's interesting. I heard her talk about this movie, or at least I heard a couple other people reference some of her thoughts on this movie. Apparently, well, two things. Apparently, she has a fear of cats. and didn't want to do this movie until they changed the cat into some other character. So then she went to cat therapy in order to get over her fear of cats to properly do this movie. If that's true, I think that's amazing. And apparently, given the backdrop of her own character here, the Sam character, and how terminally ill that she is, playing this role, I think, helped her come to terms with Chadwick Boseman's death some years ago. I think she had said that in some interview or something. I think I remember reading that in the trivia for this movie. And if that's any reason to justify that inclusion here, I'm glad it worked for her outside of the movie then as a person. So if there is maybe a therapeutic response that this movie is delivering, then I'm glad it worked for not just her, but there does seem to be a sincerity and an authenticity in how she's portraying that illness. Like I said earlier, it felt insincere at the time it was introduced because it felt like a checklist for sympathy points at first. But then I realized that maybe was kind of the point. At one point in the movie, Alex Wolff even says to Sam, yeah, I tricked you. I tricked you into coming here. The movie is kind of a trick. It's deconstructing those tricks. It's introducing those tricks only to say the tricks are there for a purpose and they really don't matter, or they do matter, but in the right ways. So I don't know if that was the intent of Michael Sarnoski to make a movie that's like deliberately deconstructing tropes. But if he is, I'm kind of glad he is, because that's what Pig was all about. Pig was a movie that set itself up as like this John Wick-like movie and then becomes anything but that. So I guess it makes sense. I kind of just talked myself into that. So yeah, I guess this movie is all about deconstructing tropes, and now I'm starting to like it even more. So thank you for being here, Shadan, for helping me see the light a little bit more and talking about this movie and finding the light.
Yeah. I know. I mean, listen, I'm no JD, but I'm happy to be here.
I think JD's gonna love this movie.
It's always a pleasure to get to deconstruct these films with you. And yeah, if you haven't seen this movie, I highly recommend going to see it in the biggest theater, and go in with an open mind, because it's not what you're expecting. And I think that's what the strength of this movie and the most beautiful thing about it. And yeah, make Lupita Nyong'o the biggest star on the planet, because we've seen time and time again that she's capable of it. And yeah,
she is so talented, for sure. I agree with that. And for those of you listening, if you agree or disagree with what we had to say here on A Quiet Place Day 1, please let us know. You can leave a comment on our Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. You can also leave us a comment below on YouTube if you're watching us there on YouTube. Be sure to rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It really helps out the show. And of course, if you have any longer thoughts for us, you can email us at insessionfilm@gmail.com. Shadan, thank you so much for being here. This was so much fun. So great to talk to you again in podcast form.
Thank you for having me. And can I plug Chasing the Gold? It's on the
just about to ask you. I was just about to ask you. Plug your stuff. Yeah. What do you do? The great work at Chasing the Gold. Let's hear about it.
So Chasing the Gold, our podcast is on the same feed as the In Session Film podcast. So stick around and check us out. And we have monthly columns covering all the races. So check that out on the website. We have such an amazing team. So yeah, if you love awards coverage, that is the place to find it.
Yeah. And if you're listening and thinking, wait, it's only June, we're getting into awards coverage now. Yes, you're damn right we are. There is stuff to talk about.
Yes. And in a perfect world, A Quiet Place Day 1 would be in the conversation, I would say.
Hey, we have this thing at In Session Film on the podcast called the In Session Film Awards, when we do every year. There are specific categories that are meant to honor movies that don't normally get honored in the traditional award circuit. So we have, for instance, Best Movie Animal. So maybe someone on that show might think to nominate one Frodo there. I'm not saying I would or even wouldn't, but that's where categories like that exist. That's why they're there. And
categories?
Categories, that was no pun intended, but now I must say pun intended. Absolutely. Thank you for that. But once again, Shadan, really appreciate you being here. All that great work you do at Chasing the Gold, really appreciate that great work there. If you're not listening, you should be. Everyone there listening, you should be checking out Chasing the Gold. It's really great stuff. And I believe that's it. Do you have any final thoughts, Shadan, as we round out this conversation?
No, always a pleasure. And I'm looking forward to wherever the Quiet Place franchise wants to take me next. I will be there.
Yeah, I'd be very curious to see what other filmmaker they can tap and let them make their own thing, because I'm glad Michael Sarnoski at least got to channel enough of his own ethos into something because of how much I love Pig. I'm glad he got the chance to do that once again. Really great stuff. A few reminders before we plug out here. We just had a review of Kinds of Kindness, the new Yorgos Lanthimos film. Myself, JD, and Maxwell Vincent had a great conversation on that one. Not much of a consensus between the three of us, which makes it a very fascinating movie nonetheless. We also just recorded episode 592, where JD and I talked about our favorite movies of the year thus far, our mid-year report. Hard to believe it is already July, but we had a great conversation there. Be sure to check that out. More great stuff to come. Be on the lookout for that. Shadan, thanks again for being here, and thank you for listening, everybody. We will see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast.